good afternoon, everyone. It is noon at 12:02. We'll just let everybody find their way into our space as we get started. Great. So lovely to see everybody. Nice to have such a nice, robust crowd here waiting for us for our Wednesday gathering today. Ramadan Mubarak to all who are observing this holy month. We hope that your fasts are easy and your revelations and your discoveries are bountiful. Very happy to see all gathered in this space. We should have a pretty dynamic conversation today. We hope that is useful for all of us to navigate through what we are finding to be very perhaps precarious, challenging, and difficult days. We are very happy today to offer a Wednesday gathering entitled Being a Spiritual Leader in Troubled Times, How to Respond When Crises Are on All Fronts. And that feels very accurate. We hope that this conversation is one that will be useful for you as we continue to navigate these waters. We are very honored today to have our president, President Brad Braxton, leading this conversation with President Emerita of CTS, Reverend Susan Thistlethwaite, Reverend Janette Wilson, National Director for PUSH, Reverend Craig Mousin, ombudsperson at DePaul University, and certainly CTS family, and Imam Tariq El-Amin. We are very happy to have as panelists today. I think without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Braxton, who is going to open us in a centering moment for our words at gathering and then lead us in this conversation. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Kim, for your leadership and convening us today. Greetings, family. Concerning my background and context, I am a Black Christian preacher, ordained in the National Baptist Convention USA denomination, who was reared in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. So, in these words of gathering, let me do what Black Christian preachers do quite regularly. Take a biblical text and talk for a moment from this title, Ready for the Revolution. I offer a reading from the New Testament epistle, Romans chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. Listen to the Apostle Paul's words. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. For in it, the justice of God is revealed. I have a dear friend who has a most intriguing greeting on his voicemail. The greeting ends with the affirmation, ready for the revolution. His phrase, ready for the revolution, is an appropriate declaration for spiritual and ethical leaders in these dangerous times. In Romans chapter 1, Paul muses on the revolutionary nature of God-directed ministry. Romans chapter 1, verses 16 through 17 contain some of the most well-known words in the New Testament. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation. For in it, the justice of God is revealed. This is a political manifesto issued by an apostolic agent of a loving and divine administration. In this text, Paul declares that those who live according to God's good news are co-conspirators with heaven against the oppressive regimes of the world. Paul says in Romans 1:15, I am eager, I am willing, I am ready to preach the gospel to you, those of you in Rome. Why was Paul so eager, so ready to come to Rome? Rome, the seat of the Caesars and their empire. Rome, the economic capital of the Mediterranean basin. Rome, the organizing hub of the world's fiercest military. Rome, a center of erudition, culture, and rhetoric. Paul must have mused to himself, since a revolution is going to occur, what better place to announce it than in Rome? If anybody needs to know that a serious rearrangement of the power structure is going to happen, it is the power brokers in Rome. I must go to Rome to tell them that Caesar does not have any good news. The good news is the power of God, not the power of Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, or Nero. And God's love-infused justice is revealed not by autocratic rule. God's justice occurs where power is shared among different people for the common good. God's justice emerges where people across deep differences still create communities of inclusion, love, and freedom. God's good news stands in opposition to the empire, whether the empire is on the banks of the Tiber River, the Potomac River, the Hudson River, or the Chicago River. My beloved siblings, do not be deceived. The imperial arrogance of Rome is not a thing of the past. Rome is alive and well, creating dehumanizing ideologies and practices. Those who believe in God and in goodness are subversive agents of a new world order, an order where the divine politics of restorative justice, generosity, and peace are first on the agenda. Some days we must mount a non-violent frontal attack on Rome. And on other days, our best work is accomplished in the shadows of an anointed anonymity. But a revolution is at hand. The pressing question of this moment is, are we ready for the revolution? Amen. Sacred siblings, as Kim has already done so ably, I want to join in a welcome to our Wednesday gathering titled Being a Spiritual Leader in Troubled Times. How to respond when crises are on all fronts. Our goal today is to spark a brave conversation around how to be a spiritual and ethical leader, especially when the forces are at work against justice and mercy and generosity and kindness. We have sages among us today, and we are eager to hear from them, to learn what they are learning, to hear where they may be struggling and succeeding. I'm delighted to share with us today that we have, in a phrase, an embarrassment of riches concerning wisdom and knowledge today. I'm going to ask for my fellow panelists to forgive me for woefully truncating each of their impressive biographical statements. I only do so in the service of having the kind of fulsome conversation that is needed in this moment. I will introduce each of our colleagues, and then when each person has been introduced, that person will offer their reflections, and then we'll have a little jam session, and then I'll offer the next introduction, and then there'll be time for community conversation. Reverend Dr. Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite is President Emerita and Professor Emerita of Chicago Theological Seminary. She is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and a prolific author and well-known media commentator, and has written numerous books and columns for the Washington Post, Huffington Post, the Chicago Tribune, as well as her own Substack, No Fear, Religion and Politics. Dr. Thistlethwaite, it is always good to have you back home. Please share your wisdom.
Thank you, Brad. And let me tell you, what you just said is a huge setup for what I want to say. I believe that Chicago Theological Seminary should declare itself a sanctuary campus. Mahmoud Khalil was arrested over the weekend here perfectly legally for speaking out nonviolently in protest. And this administration has threatened other colleges and universities with withdrawing federal funds if they allow free speech on their campuses. Now, we, as a seminary, we don't get federal funds. And I believe, and I am writing to other seminary presidents asking them to do the same. I think we need to stand and struggle with folk. Now, you know, I'm a liberation theologian, so we put a premium on action. I'm convinced that there is no action CTS could take more powerfully these days than to declare itself a sanctuary campus. Now, my church here in Santa Cruz, we are discussing becoming a sanctuary church. University Church, when I lived in Hyde Park, I went there. University Church was a sanctuary because of the people fleeing the death squads in El Salvador. I took my turn along with a lot of other people, prepared with my script in case ICE showed up at the door when we had people staying with us. And I really feel strongly that decisive action at this point, I mean, this is abolitionism, right? This is, are we going to leave and go north? My husband's great-grandparents built a false wall in their farmhouse in Indiana, and they were a station on the Underground Railroad. Women broke the law in suffrage. We had Stonewall. We had the Civil Rights Movement, a primer on how you use nonviolence to break unjust laws. And I think, and you know, it's not even against the law for CTS to become a sanctuary campus, right? theoretically, if you're dealing with an administration that respects the law. So I doubt it. But luckily, we have lawyer allies. Craig is sitting right here. We have the seminary lawyer. It needs to be checked with them so everybody knows. But then we need to let the Chicago area know that we are a sanctuary campus. And if you want to demonstrate without fear of getting kicked out of school or losing your federal funds, come here. You can come here. Because we will not stand for it. And you are so right, Brad. You got to tell Rome. You don't go, to some island off the coast of, you go to Rome and you say to Rome, no, absolutely, positively not. So that's what I have to say.
In your usual marvelous prophetic fashion, you have raised the ante and the stakes, Dr. Thistlethwaite. What I'd like to do is just pose a question or observation to you directly now, and then of course we'll have more time for the rest of the family. So I am curious for you, just very briefly, to articulate, let's say we work through the pragmatics of declaring ourselves a sanctuary campus. What is the immediate end, you think, of that? We hear the means. What is the immediate end? I know there are many that you can summon, but I'm curious to hear you just kind of concretize what is the end of that particular action. And then I have another observation I'll make, please.
Yeah, well, one of the things we could do is take back the good name of Christianity, because, these people are heretics, Brad, you know it. I mean, they wrap themselves in the flag and they carry the cross. They're giving Christianity a really bad name. So I think one of the things we can do is say no. And the no comes from a Christian heart. It comes from a Muslim heart. It comes from a Jewish heart. And so that's number one. We do exactly what you said. Say to Rome, no. But two, we will pragmatically, I think, help save campus activism or give it a place. No, I was in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall to go to a peace meeting when we had done the Just Peace document at CGS. And we met with East German pastors who were peace activists. And everywhere we went in East Germany, we were photographed by guys in black raincoats and fedoras. I mean, it was like a Jean Le Carré novel, just really, yeah, they're the secret police. And, we, the CTS folk and the students, will be photographed with it, but we have to stand up for the sanctuary of our religious convictions. It's a crucial witness right now. Free speech, religious witness. And I think we could bring those two things together in a way that, and pragmatically, it'll recruit like crazy. I sure think, Christians who do things, who knew? So, but that's kind of my preliminary thinking. I think if CTS takes up this challenge, that along the way, we'll learn stuff. And I, speaking as, someone who participated in a sanctuary church, you got to know your script. You got to have the lawyers help you to be able to do it in a way that is, plays by the law, should they choose to honor the law. So my preliminary thoughts.
To further the Pauline metaphor, the apostle, as you know, says you can't rally the troops if the trumpet's sound is indistinct. Yeah. You have blown the trumpet in a most distinctive way today. Thank you. And how fitting now that our second sibling and panelist comes to us in the person of Reverend Craig Mousin. who served as the university ombuds at DePaul University from 2001 until he retired in 2023. He is an ordained United Church of Christ minister and an attorney whose work has focused, among other topics, on asylum and immigration. And he served as an adjunct professor at DePaul's College of Law, Grace School for Applied Diplomacy, and DePaul's Refugee and Forced Migration Studies program. He too is a family member at CTS. Reverend Mousin, it is wonderful to have you at home today as well. Please share your wisdom with us.
Brad, thank you. And I've also taught a course on the Bible and immigration at Chicago Theological Seminary, which has been one of my great joys to share with students and to find their work, not just in Chicago, but when they go home to Iowa or Indiana and the city of Chicago, and it's been great. I echo Susan's comments. My church, Wellington United Church of Christ, was the second sanctuary church in the country after the Arizona churches started, and we have been involved in sanctuary work ever since then to continue as we host the Sanctuary Working Group in Chicago, and it's exciting. I want to take the first question and just that what helps me in these times of trouble, and your words from Paul are really wonderful, but it struck me that I read biographies and autobiographies. In some sense, the Bible is a story of biographies. Why did Ruth have courage to leave her land and challenge those men at the gate who wanted to turn her away and said, "You don't belong here"? And Ruth becomes a heroine of mine, that she had the faith to say, "I do belong," and give us that history. I read biographies well, just think of Jesus, right? Leads a life of resistance to the empire, but in addition, resistance to the complacency that those who thought they just had to sit and live in the empire. And then, of course, as you said, St. Paul, who challenges the empire. Currently, I've been reading Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Ella Baker, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant. He gets branded as this corrupt president, but he fought so hard to keep Reconstruction alive. They don't teach that part of his history in our, and it gives me some hope of how do we look. I just finished John Lewis's Walk with the Wind, and he's a few years older than me, and I kind of knew that, but it was nice to kind of follow when I was awakening to the need for liberation, and therefore these biographies give me hope in times of people who have struggled much more than the privileged life that I've led. So how can I give up hope when I hear these stories and see what they've done? The fellowship I received when I was at Chicago Theological Seminary was named after Jonathan Daniels, an Episcopal seminarian who took one spring break to go to Alabama to register voters in the mid-60s. He was so amazed by the people he worked with in Alabama, he sort of dropped out of seminary and went to Alabama to continue voter registration. And he paid for with his life when an Alabama deputy sheriff shot him. And the Episcopal Divinity School in Boston named a fellowship after him. And I was blessed to start my career working with refugees. So these things come together. But Jonathan's life has been one. And then I thought about my work with refugees. Every time I sit down with a refugee, they have to give me their biography. Why do they live? What was their life that made the government oppose them? What were they doing through their witness of bringing medicine to a village, or educating people, or labor solidarity, or speaking out with what we would call a First Amendment right? When I was in Lesbos talking to about 20 young teenage boys who had walked from Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria to Turkey and then crossed that water, to hear the bravery of teenage boys. And I wondered, would our children in this country, would they have the same capacity to resist and then to walk over the mountains and the snow and then the deserts and then the ocean? When I worked with a Syrian Palestinian woman who took her two very young children in a raft across the Mediterranean to get to Lesbos, and hear that story of resilience and courage, how could I not be? Now, I've been blessed to work at DePaul University for 30 years. It was founded by the Vincentians. The formal name is the Community of the Mission. And I've been told that the Latin is translated as a community gathered for the mission. And I have been so amazed to think, when you read biographies, you often think of just individuals. But all those folks I just named, as I read their stories, they were part of a community gathered for the mission. Harriet Tubman, she had to go and take someone, maybe not to Susan's husband's grandfather's home, but somebody else had to have a house in Maryland and Pennsylvania that she had to stop off at. And when I read her biography, that recent one, Night Flyer, just beautiful story, but it struck me how many people had to be engaged in that community of resistance to now, she was an amazing woman and brave and powerful, but she had that community around her that allowed her to go stopover to stopover in that sense. And Ella Baker worked with the youth when the mostly male civil rights leaders said, oh, they'll come along. And Ella was there to encourage the youth and inspires me. So I'm just going to conclude that. Last week at our worship at Wellington, we closed it singing Holly Near's song, I Am Willing. And Brad, you raised Paul saying, I am willing. And I'm going to put a link in the chat with a YouTube of that song. But the refrain from that song, if you've never heard it, go listen to it on YouTube. I am open and I am willing. To be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. And one small thing about communities, when I went to the YouTube, I just pulled one of the songs. The YouTube I'm going to share, she was singing at Fort Benning with Emma's Revolution and Carrie Newcomer. This song, my family and I for 20 years went to Fort Benning to protest the School of the Americas that taught soldiers from Central America and South America to torture and execute civilians. That community became enlarged nationally, internationally. We now go down to the Arizona border to protest the Border Patrol and things like that. And so this community gathered for the sake of mission, that community that St. Paul and Jesus and Ruth and all started, keeps expanding. Last fall, my wife and I were invited to go to Palestine, to go to Jerusalem and work with the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, because they wanted us to compare our work with Central American refugees with that of those in the West Bank and in Gaza. And we heard a story of resilience. And one of our hosts said, this land has been occupied by 20 empires, and we're still resilient. So I'll leave that. We're facing one empire today, but we have many friends in the generations of communities of resistance. And I offer that as a spark of resistance for all of us.
Reverend Mousin, thank you for those compelling reflections. Once again, the sound of the trumpet is very distinct. As I listened to your musings with my third ear, punctuated throughout your sharing was the centrality of narrative, story, and also consistent reference to young people. And given the decades of your distinguished service at a major university, I am curious, if you were to join me and Dean Jason Fry on a recruiting trip to any college, liberal arts college, university, and talk to some 18 or 19-year-old leaders, what would be your principal message, your principal narrative to those emerging leaders?
Sign me up. But my freshman year in college was a spring of Kent State. And that has been a major moment in my life, because I had to confront that issue of walking home. We were on strike at my campus and thinking we could have been murdered today too. And my mother always said she hated war, but she said one of the nice things about my experience was that I had to make that decision. That spring, every college student around the country had to say, which side of the line are you on? And then live that out. And I was fortunate to be in Baltimore. We get to Washington and protest and all, but you had to make that decision, and you had to realize you had a voice. And your voice could be heard when you gathered in community, when you struck as a group. When the Teamsters honored our strike at my college, it was a moment of we can build communities beyond just college students. And we actually were one of 2 universities that summer that voted to ban recruiters on campus. Now, sadly, that summer, Wilbur Mills passed a bill that any campus that banned recruiters would lose all federal funding. And so our board of trustees kind of backed off a little bit. But it taught me we did have a voice and you could community. And I would like to talk to those students and say, and what CTS taught us, you have a voice and you have to choose to exercise it.
Reverend Mousin offline, Dean Fry and I will be talking to you and we'll make some travel plans sooner rather than later. Thank God for the sages as they speak. And our third panelist and sage is the Reverend Dr. Janette Wilson, who is the senior advisor to the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr. and the national executive director of Push for Excellence. She has been involved with Operation Push since she graduated from law school in 1980. At Operation Push, utilizing her ministry and legal training, she has implemented day-to-day operations and created community development programs, and she remains actively involved in civil and human rights advocacy. Dr. Wilson is also a family member here at CTS. Great to have you at home today. Dr. Wilson, please share your wisdom with us.
Well, I would say thank you, but you put me in the midst of all these great theologians and authors of great books, and I don't know how I fit. What I can say to you is this is a critical moment in history, and so none of us have ever experienced what we're experiencing today. We never could have imagined that our nation, supposed to be the country of the free world, would be existing like this. We thought that the empires were over there. We did not think we would have an empire here in this manner. And like you, I was born in the South. And so I experienced racism very directly. It was not hidden. Born in Tennessee on a farm, a family farm. I guess I'm a third generation out of slavery. So I understand migration from a different perspective. My ancestors didn't choose to come here. We were brought here and placed in slavery in a manner that was just heinous. And so as I look at where we are today, Second Chronicles, the 20th chapter, comes to my mind, where Jehoshaphat was surrounded by enemies on every side, and in your life where you can't figure out a way out. You might want to do what Jehoshaphat did. You have to call a national prayer and fasting. And it's interesting that we're in the middle of Lent. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is the people of faith have to become strengthened in the understanding that God has more power than any empire or emperor, would-be emperor or would-be king, which is what we are faced with today. And so I think that there is a moment for prayer and fasting, and the prophetic voices must stand up. And so the story in Jehoshaphat, and they had the prayer, and there's a time where the song that Craig lifted up, you got to sing, because you have to acknowledge that victory is really already there. You just have to be believing that it's possible. Now, that doesn't mean we don't do anything.
Dr. Wilson, I believe you muted yourself. Yeah.
Dr. Thistlethwaite said, you ought to be a sanctuary, the campus. I think the faith community has to stand boldly, visibly present in this moment. When we just left Selma, right? The anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery. It was not until the faith prophetic voices put their physical bodies at risk to go across that Edmund Pettus Bridge. Otherwise, they would have just kept killing innocent people. But somehow, when every faith tradition locked arms and represented themselves at the beginning of that march with Dr. King and others, when they walked across, somehow the dogs were not able to reach them. Somehow the police that would beat the other people wouldn't hit them. And they took that march all the way across the bridge. I think faith leaders are not standing boldly, representing the word of God. And whatever your tradition is, you ought to be able to stand on the word, the promises of God. And as a Baptist Christian, I know what God can do. And so I think that we ought to not only have
Dr. Wilson, you muted again, and we need to hear all of your wisdom.
what's happening. We ought to be able to take a day, every day. It's the Baptists, it's the Methodists, it's the Muslims, it's the rabbi coming there as a witness for God, that we're standing with those who are dropped off in Chicago, and we can challenge seminaries around the country and faith leaders around the country. We ought to occupy these seminaries in a manner that says, we are here standing with you. They need shelter, they need encouragement, and every day at a certain time we can have prayers. But also we talk about the possibility of change. Like there's a group of UCC pastors that are marching in DC every Wednesday. We have to make this go viral around the nation, and we have the power. And as I was listening to Reverend Craig, Attorney Craig Mousin, we also have to read to encourage ourselves. I think the Bible encourages us, but Dr. Frank Thomas has us reading Preaching in the Shadow of Hitler. I think that we must learn from our ancestors. What did they do when faced with an empire that you don't understand, you didn't expect, and you don't know how to deal with? So they preached certain sermons. We must look at their sermons, but we must preach them more publicly. It cannot be limited to my church, your church. It must be a unified voice. Everybody gonna preach from Romans today. And then for the rabbis, we might have to look at an Old Testament text, and but we have to begin to encourage our people and let them know the God that we serve is not the God of the empire. And we have to speak powerfully. And I think students need to see us on these campuses. I think your caravan to college campuses everywhere will be powerful, but most particularly and most specifically in those 11 Southern red states. We must go as if we were freedom riders. We're a sanctuary caravan across America. We cannot allow this force of evil to reign without a challenge. And I believe once we step forward, God will carry us. When I went to Mississippi with Reverend Jackson, I had never been to Mississippi. I had no idea. We went in '83 because he did a Southern Crusade across the South on voter registration. And I didn't believe that in 1983 there would be a sheriff with guns strapped across his chest, meeting people at the door of the polling place, saying to them, you know what to do. And at that time, they were killing people or intimidating people in Mississippi. While we're there, they burned a church, all of the insides of the church, and it just had a frame. So, of course, Reverend Jackson wanted to go to the church. I'm like, dude, let's go home, because these people are serious down here. We went to the church and we praying in the embers, and I'm like, well, this is the one time I'm not closing my eyes. I got to watch as well as pray. So I'm saying we have to move. The faith leaders have to move. You can't just sit behind doors and not even talk about it. So I agree. Open up CTS. We can get lawyers to help design what that looks like. And every faith must be invited. It's your day. It's your time. And I think if we move, the rest of the country will follow. That's my thought.
Brilliant and bold. The trumpet is sounded again. As I listened with my third ear, in the initial moments of your reflections, you talked about many people in the United States saying empires are over there, they're not here. And I want to connect that reflection with your emphasis on some very important and traditional spiritual practices. You mentioned prayer, fasting, and preaching. I'd be curious for you just to briefly say something about how those spiritual practices help revolutionary movements by rooting out our own arrogance that sometimes we and these progressive movements fail to acknowledge that we are complicit in profound ways. And we do a lot of this, and maybe we need to do more of this so that we can get clearer on our own moral commitments. Say just a little more about prayer, fasting, preaching.
Well, I think if you look at every prophet, they had a prayer life. At the end of the day, you have to be communicating with God. And I think we don't pause enough to ask God to reveal to us, to empower us, to encourage us in these next few moments. And I think the withdrawal from things, meaningless conversations, meaningless pastimes, where we just, during this Lenten season, it's not how much food you don't eat, it's what do you do with the time that God has given us, these moments. How do you eat so much and then you watch people that are here as migrants, immigrants, have no food to eat and have no place to eat it comfortably? They're eating on the run, particularly now. And so there has to be a moment of prayer, reflection, and fasting. And then you cannot just preach as if this has not happened. So we have to empower faith leaders. This is, it's like you have a lectionary. The lectionary doesn't fit for today because it wasn't planned. This moment was not planned. So I can't preach from a standard script from a lectionary that was produced 4 years ago. We have to look at, what do you say now? That's why looking at what they said during Hitler's time, this man is modeling Hitler. His playbook is being revealed. So we have to know what the playbook looks like so we can respond to it. And the best way to look at the playbook is to look at the Bible. It has happened, like you talked about Romans, the empire, we've been fighting the empire since the existence of man. So we have to look at, what did the prophets say? How did Amos throw that plumb line down? And, so we have to begin to help people see this is a moment in our time for prophetic voices. It is not a moment to entertain. It is not a moment to soothe. It is a moment to make people understand God is able. However, we cannot keep doing what we're doing. We're not going to let them do this to you. You can't let seniors lose Social Security, let seniors lose Medicare. And because somebody's playing a Russian roulette with the lives of people, cannot do that. I know I'm getting very passionate. I'm sorry.
Passion is always allowed at home. Thank you for the prophetic musings. Our fourth family member and panelist, Imam Tariq El-Amin, is the Imam of Masjid Al-Taqwa, located on the southeast side of Chicago. He is deeply involved in interreligious work and community service, focusing on building relationships and fostering dialogue among diverse communities. His leadership also amplifies the importance of spiritual practices in individual and communal healing and transformation. Imam El-Amin, welcome home. It's great to have you. Please share your wisdom with us.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Braxton. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. May the peace that only God can give be upon all of you. Ramadan Mubarak for those who are observing the fast. I really had to rearrange my response as I have the benefit of listening to my esteemed panelist. And one of the things that I want to begin with is, I think this is a wonderful time to be a believer. And for that, I say, Alhamdulillah, which is all praises is due to God. And it's a wonderful time because we know from our tradition The Quran reminds us that for every prophet and every righteous movement, there has been an adversary, an evil one among men, among the jinn, the spirits. It says, and they whisper to each other in deceptive and illusory discourses, right? So they promote this idea of an imaginative, an unreal reality. And when Reverend Janette, Dr. Janette just mentioned that the God that we serve is not the God of the empire, I could not help but think about our currency, which is in less and less supply, or we are in less and less contact with, because we've moved to digital forms of payment. And on our currency, there's the phrase, in God we trust. In God we trust. Now, we do recognize that the God of this empire, it is not the God that demands justice from us, that we uphold justice, that we be stewards of justice. And even if, as is mentioned in the Quran in the fourth surah, the fourth chapter, the 135th verse, where it says, "O you who believe, stand firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even as against yourselves, even as against yourselves." So that's not the God that we're talking about when we think about the national or the economic conversation. So we've been sold this idea of rugged individualism by conglomerates that are clear about their adherence to their communal structure and pushing us away from the realization that we need to form community that goes beyond what is convenient for us, but that really represents an adherence to this idea of stewardship, what we refer to as the Khalifa, which is the vicegerent, the steward that is responsible for upholding justice, that is responsible for upholding human dignity. And pushing back against this idea, once again, this idea of a rugged individualism that perpetuates this idea of, I will only be invested in what is good for me. I will only speak up for what is in my personal interest. And if it's not in my interest, I have nothing to say about it. Right. So that's one of the things that we look at. So this also is fortunate. I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation right now, because during the month of Ramadan, we are reminded, we are told, Allah tells us in the Quran, says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kutiba alaykumus siyamu kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed for you as it was prescribed to those who came before you, that you may have taqwa. And taqwa is this, it's not just a fear, it's a reverence, it's a awe, it is a trust, it is a form of armament that is only due to God. So just like I mentioned, says in God we trust on the currency. This is a moment where those who believe actually get to really show if they have real trust in God. And during these difficult times, it is also important for us to remember that the commandment that God has given us to stand firmly for justice, to join in community, to recognize the human dignity of the human family, to see the distinctions, the differences that we have, not as points of contention, but points of curiosity, for us to engage one another, to find out the value of those nuances, those distinctions, and to push back against this idea that everything is a commodity. And again, I'm really appreciative of this moment as well, because to be in conversation with my sacred siblings and to push back against maybe what could be for some a subconscious, kind of a subconscious burden that many bear, whereas the commodification of religiosity, or the commodification of scripture or religion, right? This idea of a religious marketplace that determines how we present ourselves in the public space. So as an imam, an association of the late Imam Warathuddin Muhammad, he was one who really focus not just on the ritual, but how do we translate that into our impact on the public space, what he referred to as our shared freedom space. Our shared freedom space. So we are in a moment of time that is not for, and I don't say this with any no derision or dismissiveness of the worry that may be on folks at this particular moment, but really as a call back to reality. One of the names that we have for God, for Allah, is Al-Haq, is the sure reality, right? God's word is the reality. God's purpose that he has ordained for us, that is the reality that we are trying to impress and trying to build into the public, that shared freedom space. So this is not a time for weak people. And when I say weak people, I mean those who are weak of understanding, weak of intellect, and weak of purpose. And there is an intentional manipulation that is happening to those people who find themselves falling into those categories, where their perception of what is real is being manipulated, and they're operating from a position of only what is in their interest, and they're actually working against their interest. And we got a lot of people with buyer's remorse right now. A lot of people, they thought that they were making a decision that was good for them, but they realized that they have been manipulated. So as in closing, I just remind us that I think this is a wonderful time for those who believe, because we understand that God does not place a burden on any soul greater than it can bear. That we will, and then also from the Quran, it says, "Do you think you will be left alone, saying that you believe and not be tested?" The test is a part of the process of us expressing the true commitment and conviction of our profession of faith. And we are blessed to be in a time where we can have these conversations across, regardless of our faith traditions and religious identities, and understand that we have a job that is bigger than us, but it cannot be accomplished without us. So I thank you for the opportunity. I'm really appreciative that I got to listen to everybody else, because I just kind of threw away what I was, I had some notes. I said, no, they were so impactful. So thank you so much.
Again, the trumpet is so clear, and you have lifted the veil. And as Dr. Wilson said, sometimes whatever the reading is for the day, we got to play jazz with it on the fly. And you demonstrated that so brilliantly. In your reflections, Imam El-Amin, you took us on a grand journey from deception. What a great phrase, the unreal reality. From deception to this profound concept of reverence. As we go from deception to reverence and a deep appreciation for dignity and reverence of the divine, in the middle there, I sense that a lot of people are struggling with fear and fatigue. On the journey from the unreal reality to reverence, how do we empower one another and address our fear and our fatigue?
That's a beautiful question, because this is the pragmatic basis of how do we move from simply what we say, from simply what we know to be the reality, and how to put that into our lives. And one of the ways that we do that, we follow the examples of the prophets, of those of our righteous predecessors who have always engaged in prayer and fasting, in keeping the tongue moist with the praises of God. So again, during this time of Ramadan, and as I said, the fast has been prescribed for us. It is a way for us to assert our leadership over the vessel that God has entrusted us with. Now, in times of uncertainty where there's so much going on around us that we feel like we don't have the ability to control, God has given us not just the license, but the commandment to say, take control of yourself. And if you're able to control yourself, control your appetites, control your tongue, control the conversations. One of the other panelists mentioned earlier about just the idle talk, the backbiting, the gossiping, right? Being willing to be charitable, right? The fast itself, it sensitizes us to the needs and the realities of those who are on a perpetual fast, or a fast where they're not certain when they're going to be able to break their fast because they don't have the wherewithal, the resources, right, to provide for themselves. So it really is to take hold of this vessel. And then once we do that, we start to recognize those others who are also on that same journey. And there's a natural community that forms when we do that. And that is the God conscious. That's the taqwa. It's the community of taqwa, by whatever way you would phrase it, that begins to come out, and it has a building, a snowballing effect. So we go from doing, and that doing increases our belief. It increases our faith. So just start with the self, start with the doing.
Marvelous reflections. I say to my sacred sibling, Kim Schultz, with this embarrassment of riches that we have received, it is so hard to even think about containing this within the hour. We want to be respectful of people's time, and I am going to exercise, with your permission, Kim, just an ounce of presidential prerogative and invite a question or two or reflection from the family. It would just be, in my estimation, inappropriate
Yes.
to not be
For
able
those
to.
who have to leave, please do. Otherwise, by all means, let's
We want to
extend
honor
just a
that,
few moments.
and maybe somebody will be watching this who can invest, because I believe these four panelists need to be heard all over Chicagoland, the country, and the world. This rich mixture, these diverse and profound perspectives are enlivening spirits and souls and minds right now. So I invite you, Kim, and others in our leadership team to help us field any questions in the chat, or feeling free to unmute. Let's engage now our panelists with great appreciation for their rich reflections.
If there are thoughts or questions, you may unmute yourself, or you may put it in the chat as Dr. Braxton has suggested. Please do not be shy.
Well, I want all of this to be shared. And I think we have to highlight the deliberate media blackout of, veterans are marching March 14th because of the threats to them. How much of the news media is going to cover that? And so I think another thing we need to do, and Craig mentioned that I write this Substack, we have to find other ways to get the word out in order for people to be encouraged and also inspired to act. But that is a big part of this unreality. I mean, that there's this, everything is really fine. Don't look at your 401k. And, it's just a regime of untruth. And so that's another thing that Janette, I am sure Bush is working on this. I'm absolutely sure of it. But it's it's deliberate, and we have to get around it.
I think the seminary has an obligation to engage in practical theology, and not in the talking theology. And so I would recommend that in a crisis, if you're hungry, you have to eat every day. If you are in need of shelter, you don't need it one day a week. And so I think we have to be more intentional about these messages, that they should go out on YouTube, Facebook, and so forth. But to have, you have rich resources, starting with you, Dr. Braxton, that can begin. We're in Babylon. I don't even think we're in Rome. We're in Babylon. So we have to act like we're in Babylon. I remember reading about the slaves. They had to figure out how to communicate, to her point, from one plantation to the next. We didn't even speak the same language, but music was the thing that helped us. Our ability to beat the drums, and also we could sew patches that would give us pathways to freedom. And so we have to begin to think about the patches would be the different faith traditions coming together to make sure that we are communicating the messages to various groups and to young people they're not in most institutions. They're on TikTok with all that and other forms. We've got to expand our communication outside of the narrow confines of people who are learned, so to speak. Gotta speak to ancient.
If I could just bring a moment of my.
I'm on TikTok. I'm on TikTok because the young people are there, you know?
That's where they are. They post reels.
We have
You
a
got a hand
question,
up.
a hand is raised as well, Swamini. And I'm sorry, Dr. Mousin, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, please, if the doctor has anything more to say, my heart will melt even more. So please, if there's anything to add. Okay, I will ask then. First of all, this is amazing, this panel, and please get this out far and wide. I co-founded the Pan-African Association, a refugee resettlement agency that was around for 17 years. And when I was listening to Dr. Mousin, I became even more enamored. And I thought that what we need to do right now is stand up for refugees, right? We have more refugees in this world than we ever have had in the history of mankind, as far as we know. And yet our refugee resettlement programs are closing. There are literally refugees who've just come in after having waited for 20 years in refugee camps from across the world who are supposed to be helped to resettle here and to learn livelihoods and to get over the terrible traumas they faced. But now the refugee resettlement agencies programs are closing. So what can we do as leaders, as seminarians, as seminaries, as churches, as all faiths, as you so beautifully said, Dr. Wilson, to make a difference right here and right now? How can we step up even more in the face of the shame?
May I, Dr. Braxton? Let me just change your words a little from the passive are closing, that the current administration has closed the funding for refugee resettlement. The refugee agencies don't want to be closed. They are their lifeblood of federal funds, which isn't very much for every refugee they resettle. And Illinois is great. The late Dr. Edwin Silverman was the founder of Refugee Resettlement Illinois, which became a model for the nation. And one of those biographies inspires me. So I think we have to go back and say, as all of us to our Congress, that 100,000 refugees could be resettled if the administration lifted and allowed refugees to come. But it is a bigger fight than that. I'm going to tell one really quick story that I've told in some other places, but a church out in Maine was working with an asylum seeker whose family was in Africa, and they were working through the Welcome Corps to resettle his wife and 6 children. And they were this close to getting on a plane after 2 years of vetting. And at Christmas time, the member of the church, his parents hosted a Christmas party, and the parents said to the asylum seeker, "Isn't it great? Next Christmas, your family will be able to come to this party and celebrate around the Christmas tree." A month later, we get a new administration, closes the Welcome Corps, closes refugee resettlement, and those parents had voted for Trump. And we asked those parents that they go back to that asylum seeker and say, because of this election and your vote, this family may never get reunited. We have to tell those stories. Tariq, I think you said buyer's remorse. Those folks who voted thinking one thing and are now seeing people in their congregations, we have to tell that story nationwide, that the refugee resettlement program, people are vetted over 2 years. They get more vetting than almost anyone. They're the safest people to come in. And then they're vibrants in our communities. They're in Somalians in Minneapolis and Portland, Maine, and in Laotians in Iowa. And Chicago has so many different refugees. So we have to tell the story of why this is a benefit to us. And can I say one more thing, Dr. Braxton? I'm sorry. sometimes I'll bring some of my diplomacy school in. Sometimes, even when we're in war, we have to talk across the table. There's a lot of conservative Christians who think they're being persecuted and they're the remnant. They think they're in a war right now. We have to find a way to show them a different way. Justice Alito in the Supreme Court thinks Christians are being persecuted. As a lawyer, when I put my lawyer hat on, I'm thinking, okay, when we get that sanctuary case to go to the Supreme Court, Justice Alito, where is your protection for people of faith who will offer sanctuary? I'm not sure he will be consistent, but at least we have to call him at it because he's so moving the free exercise law, the jurisprudence, protecting in his mind those conservative Christians. We have to be there too and say, we have a faith. We have to respond to the stranger in our midst, and that First Amendment should protect us as well.
I think you need to go back to that point because we have to indicate that their faith is not the only faith. We have a much broader faith, and I think that's what Hitler did. He redefined Christianity and faith. We must stand on what our faith stands for and requires. And if you say you are a Christian, there are some basic tenets that you must follow. And if you fail to adopt these principles, and y'all are theologians, you know more than I do, you are not acting as a Christian. You are contradicting your basic beliefs and tenets of your faith. And nobody is saying that to them. Alito is playing a game like all of them. When Hitler was doing Nazi Germany, he got rid of media, which is what Dr. Thistlethwaite is talking. He took control of images, media, and then he decided to paint himself as God. So he redefined what the faith was for Christians. And then everybody that didn't believe in what he said, you are the enemy. And so I think we have to say this is the correct faith. And I don't think we're beating them up, but they need to go back to the Bible that started them or the Quran, and say, hey, this is what your basic book says. How do you go past that? And we have to have some dialogues, not beating them up. But you can't pretend to be a Christian and say some of this stuff that they're saying.
I would like to add, if I may, to expand a bit on this. It is always, I think it is more apparent, the treatment or the mistreatment of the stranger, of the refugee, than it is the neglect and degradation of our neighbors. And by that, I mean, I think about the Great Migration, and that was a migration of refugees fleeing the South, looking for safety and security and opportunity. And as you all might have similar histories, my great-grandparents and my grandparents left from Arkansas, two of them was run out of Louisiana, and they were not met with a wonderful reception when they got here. We know, I'm sure we're all very familiar with redlining and the lack of city services, the intentional blight that was thrust upon these neighborhoods, the overcrowding, lack of services, all of these things. Now, I know that right now, our collective eye, we are looking at the mistreatment and the politicization of what should be a very human response to the need of people who have been run out of their homes, and our government, and by extension us, right, because our government operates on our behalf, has played a major role in the destabilization of many places throughout Latin America, just throughout the world, period. Right. So there's a certain sense of responsibility and care that should be extended. And at the same time, because this is not an either or, it's not either or, but at the same time, I think about, I just saw on the news the other day, African-American man around the same age as myself, I think it's about 52, 53. And he was just released from prison. He was wrongfully imprisoned for 30 years. And maybe a week before, I saw another, almost the same amount of time. When we think about what we are what we are bringing refugees into.
Mm.
When we think about the system of what has been normalized here in terms of just looking at anti-Blackness, just looking at the normalization of the dispossession that is taking place, how communities are still, they are simply looked at as this is just how it is, and not as in this is what we have produced, right? These are all intentional products. And I think as we look at the needs of the refugee, the needs of the stranger, we must also be as vested in looking at the needs of our neighbors, the needs of those that we pass by on a daily basis. So I think that's really important to be able to balance both of those things. And we understand there's a saying that says charity begins at home and spreads abroad. And if we are not addressing the needs of those at home, then we are bringing folks into a home that is destined for failure. And the last thing I'll say quickly is that we are also responding to things with the sense of there's a reaction. There's a reaction to what's happening, as opposed to a sustained plan, and realizing that our responses are going to take time. And if we don't have the deliberation and the intentionality of crafting a long-term strategy, we will always be on defense.
I totally agree with the last two speakers, but I want to point out that the cruelty is the point. And Janette's bringing up the importance of engagement. These folk are being subject to a deep moral degradation. Mm-hmm. And in my experience of working domestic violence and so forth, it can't help but bleed. It bleeds to the whole society, bleeds families, and it is a deliberate attempt to destroy the moral fiber of people in this country. And it is demonic. I swear to God. I mean, let's bring out the big theological words. It is demonic. Humans do. So, but it's just, you got to realize, as I think we do. I mean, why did Musk say empathy is weakness, you little so-and-so? And it just making people cruel, choosing cruelty. And I thought, Greg, your idea of having people actually confess what they did is a good one, because confession is the road to repentance and change. But that's a heavy lift, folks. You know it.
The multi-dimensional nature of this conversation is so inspiring. I want to just highlight the chat is just so intensely alive, and our colleague at CTS and sibling, Rachel Payton, might I just highlight the rich information you placed in the chat and invite you, if you are so led, to unmute and just vocalize that in the space. Very, very apropos to hear your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Braxton. I put in the chat that I'm the Director of Theological Field Education at CTS, and in the classroom right now, we're engaging Prentice Hemphill's book, What It Takes to Heal, How Transforming Ourselves Can Change the World. And 16 students in the class each week. We meet on Tuesdays, and they and we and I are hungry for this is the action in response. This is how we're inviting you to show up, and this is what it can look like in your body and in practice. And it is one thing we're talking about this in class as well. It's one thing to be able to write our theologies very well, to be in discussion about our theologies on a regular basis. It is another to embody them and to show up in community. And we're talking about embodiment practices. How do we care well for our bodies so that we can sustain our activism over time? So often the body is ignored, and that's where and how we show up in the world constantly. So it's just been such rich and also challenging conversations in that classroom, and to hear from these leaders in ministry, Bayan students, CTS students, about how this is how I'm showing up in my CPE and field placement, and this is what I need and what I'm questioning in the process. What should and can that look like, given all of the challenges that we're meeting today and have been throughout this country's history?
Such timely reflections, Rachel, and you help us to put as fine a point as possible on the reality that our classrooms are theaters of engagement in this revolution. It should not be lost on us the energy across the last few years, for example, that has been directed to junior kindergarten through 12th grade classrooms, let alone higher education. So thank you for lifting up so powerfully what is happening in classrooms and beyond. I am almost embarrassed, and I'm praying that heaven will not hold me responsible for attempting to put an ellipsis, to be continued, and not a period in this conversation. I want to do that by raising one of the most troubling aspects over the last 5 years for me, for any panelist who may have just a brief response. I know that what I'm about to share requires perhaps Kim Schultz, the second version of this conversation. Here's what I've been wrestling with, and I need help from sages. This summer will mark the 5-year anniversary of one of the most potent turn-ups, to use the language from activists, turn-ups in the country's recent history. As many of us remember, in the summer of 2020, to the tune of tens and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, good trouble, righteous agitation around all of these larger issues that we've been talking about. And yet, here we are. Need any reflections? And again, maybe this is the 2.0 version of this panel, but I am certain there are some people who are struggling and saying, we did all that just 5 years ago. And there was a strategy among adversaries to wait us out, knowing that compassion fatigue and premature congratulation over a few minor victories would take us off of our game. Can any of you speak to any musings that you might have about how do we go forward? What's going to be different this time, given all that we saw and all that we did so faithfully and courageously and passionately just 5 years ago?
Well, I think faith has to lead the movement for ultimate change. It's not political. It's not just economic. It's faith. And we have to make the moral argument for change to occur. You know, sometimes you can say, well, it was horrific that these things happened. It's a little bit more than that. We are in a place where there is no value of human life. We are literally, by our policies, killing children in Haiti, killing children in the Congo, in Ukraine, by our very policies. Our American public policy, internationally and locally, does not value the life of anyone except the few leaders of the empire. So I think that we have to think about how do we
hear you, Dr. Wilson. You're here.
Oh, okay. I
Yep.
think that we have to.
Recording in progress.
What did I do?
think you re-entered somehow, so if you, I can try to remove the other person.
You got. So I think that we have to decide how can we really, really, really deal with this crisis from a faith-led perspective, knowing that public policy comes after there is a faith-led protest that can be sustained. You can't just come in and we do something today. This is a long-term action, and it requires us as faith institutions, as faith-led training institutions like seminaries, they have to change. They've not changed in 5 years, respectfully. Keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same result. We have to lead the change. If you at CTS say we are going to be a sanctuary, and we challenge every faith institution to consider it, and here's how you do it, here's the legal requirements, here's how we need to convene our family. You know what I'm saying? I think that just starting there, Mousin knows the legal, he can get some other lawyers and really talk about, that's what they did with Project 25. They sat down and planned this stuff. We have to plan. I'm not just saying go act, it's planning. I did an interfaith legal committee for the Chicago Bar some years ago, because every faith tradition has lawyers, but they're not asked to deal with this issue. How can you protect your institution if it wants to be a sanctuary? And so I think that's the next dialogue. How do we make it happen? Because they're not just Ukrainians came in here, we didn't even know they were here. And now you got all these other people being dropped on us like they're ants or something, and they're people. Children sleeping in police stations. Every time I see tents in Chicago, it makes me just want to go and pick everybody up and take them home, because it's not tenable. You know, we have closed school buildings and nobody has fought for that. Open these doggone buildings and put the people in them. We're paying heat and water. So I just think we have to be the example of the change we want. I'm sorry to take so much time, but I am very passionate about this moment. It's our moment. I really think,
obviously, Janette, I totally agree with you, but I also would like to lift up that the last 5 years were extremely successful. And that's what scared them.
mm-hmm.
What do you mean we're going to actually have to not only pay lip service to diversity, but do it?
Yeah.
Oh, women had gotten the ability to control their own bodies. Well, that's got to go. And I think this was very successful. Racism is America's original sin.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. You found a nation on the deathly exploitation of other people. And it's there. It's there in the faith journey of this nation. And it has yet to repent. And that was a call to repentance. And here they are trying to scrub off Black Lives Matter Plaza, right? I mean, how symbolic is that? But I think it was because it's been successful.
Yeah.
And people need to, and let's do more of that. But I do think we have a deep theological problem in this country. This is sin. This is sin, and it has to be named as that. And we have to, as a nation, lead people to repent. And one of the good ways you can repent is to change. So that's Susan's little sermon.
I would add to that. I agree with very much just about everything that you said there. I would expand the invite us to look at the idea of success. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There are some comforts that many may have enjoyed during the past 5 years, but to consider it successful in the larger sense, I would say we fall short of using that particular descriptor, because we still have as of right now, not just the thousands of non-combatants that have died, that have been killed in Gaza, the millions who have been removed from their homes as refugees in Sudan, right? Upwards of 8, maybe 9 million, it may be more than that, but millions and millions. The bevy of normalized injustices that take place here on a regular basis, the treatment of our veterans, the fact that we have homelessness and vacant buildings at the same time, right? This contradiction that has just become so normal that people don't even pay attention to it. It screams that no, I wouldn't use success as the word. And then I would also say that because there is not a juxtaposition, but there's an interplay, the connection between faith and politics, that we have to really examine this political relationship that we have, because our politicians have not, broadly speaking, they have not served the actual needs of the people. Yeah. They are more concerned about staying in office than discharging the responsibilities of that office. So there's a compromise that has been made, and we have to be able to recognize it. And the last thing I'll say is, while this is like I said, I've enjoyed the conversation that we're having and the ideas that have come out of it. Our responsibility, whether it be as a seminary, whether it's a masjid, a church, a temple, a synagogue, it does not end with those who enter those four walls. Our responsibility is for our shared freedom spaces, for the public space. So there's a whole campaign of education that has to take place right now. And education is to be sensitized to your own value and the value of other human beings. And that's where and because we are separated from that, people can look at the cruelty that takes place. They can look at other people being dispossessed. They can look at other people being falsely accused and incarcerated and spending 30 years in prison. And there's no march for that. They can look at people being separated from their families when they come here looking for refuge. And there's nothing about that. So it speaks to a need that we all, a responsibility, I believe, that we all have to really sensitize the public, not just those who come looking for the word, but for those who are in need of the word. And that's a collective responsibility, I would say.
I agree with you, except the fact that, this was limited and partial success, but
partial.
For the prejudiced, it was like, holy Christmas. And, they actually want change. And I have, through Washington think tank people, have told me, and I don't have any direct evidence of this, that it was the George Floyd protest that started those folks writing Project 2025. And they set out of what they were going to destroy in order for true equality in this country to never happen. And so I want to connect that with Janette's, but I totally agree with you, Tariq, that, in terms of success, no, but I do want to emphasize that it was a wake-up call to these people that actual change could happen. And
could I just add, again, in agreement with all in many ways. And Tariq, I love your idea of how do we define success. I just want to share this. I mentioned earlier the Sanctuary Working Group in Chicago. It started with 5 groups during COVID who were trying to house young men and women who, when they turned 18, were taken out of youth detention by ICE and put into the adult penal colonies. And it was like, can we do something? And they started finding housing for those people. And then through COVID, it's now grown to over 40 organizations, including Organized African Communities, Sisters of Mercy, Episcopal Diocese, Catholic Charities, and trying to find housing. So the kind of issue in our communities and through a variety of means, including paying rent in other places, but people opening their homes. Susan, I don't know if you remember, I think it was Michael Johnson in my class used to challenge us liberals and saying, yeah, you get a homeless shelter, but how many of you are taking a homeless into your home? Right?
You mean Mike Dyson?
No. Michael John, she went to Boston.
Oh, I know who you mean. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. And she'd always challenge us like, yeah, talk about homeless shelters, but what are you doing personally? Can you take a homeless into your home? And I'd wrestle with that because I wasn't doing that. But I've seen in the sanctuary working group, some people say, yeah, we'll take a family and put them in our house for a year till they can get self-sufficient and work out. So I think all these levels we've got to work on. I just also read Eddie Glaude's book, We Are the Leaders We Are Looking For, that moral imagination, and Ella Baker getting the youth to say, we have a moral imagination. So it's not just the leaders we've got to change, but those, as Tariq, you're saying, around us. And getting that sense of, can we have that moral imagination for whatever capacity each of us has?
Yeah.
Whether it's a building or whether it's my house or whether it's my community can pay rent for one family, we can at least move on that. So I'd encourage that moral imagination for all of us at this time.
On behalf of the CTS family, I want to thank each one of our panelists and all of our panelists for allowing us to enter into such a profound wisdom circle today. There is a key member of my personal wisdom circle, the Reverend Dr. James A. Forbes, the Senior Minister Emeritus of the Riverside Church. And often when I talk to Dr. Forbes, he says this: now that we have heard the good news, how do we go forth and tangibilitate it? So let us take this conversation today and let's do some tangibilitating. And now more than ever, I know that I am ready for the revolution. Thanks to one and all, sending blessings and love.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great being with you all. Take care.